About 10 years ago, I did whatever job was necessary to pay the bills. I split wood, cleaned houses, bussed tables, anything really. Like I said, whatever would pay the bills. The only way that I got my name out there was word of mouth. I'd have friends or people that I worked for just recommend me for whatever was needed to be done. Gardening, farming, I could do it all. Whatever I could do to contribute, just to earn some money. So I was shocked and happy and a little taken aback when I got this call to clear out and do some repairs on this old house. From what I was told, it had been abandoned by its former owners years ago and purchased by someone new. And everything was left in the house. Like they just up and took off one night, not caring what the hell they left behind. Paul wanted all that shit cleared out, and he was gonna pay me good money for it. But to top it off, I was told whatever I found in there that I wanted, I could keep. That was really one of the main reasons I took this job, you see. Because this house was about 2 hours away from where I lived, so it wasn't necessarily something I could just drive to and from. But the thought of finding a stack of $100 bills or some jewels in an abandoned safe, or a pot of gold, or even hell, just a cool old jukebox, that was enough to send my mind spiraling and my imagination running wild. It sounded too good to be true. Well, everybody that's listening, let me give you a piece of advice. If something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. I drove over there the first day. I was even told I could spend the night there, or stay as long as I wanted. I could just pack my pickup truck up and take everything out load by load. So I threw some blankets, pillows, and an air mattress in my cab. I was gonna stay there, but I wasn't necessarily fond of sleeping on a bed that had been abandoned for God knows how long. Who the hell knows what was on those beds? As I drove there, my mind was still racing at the things I might stumble across. When I got there, though, my first reaction was, who the hell would actually buy this dump? It looked like it was part of an old scary movie. It had shutters that were broken off, the balcony that wrapped around the porch was broken down, the paint was peeling off, the lawn was so dead that it was just dirt at this point. There's a lot of property on it, sure, but this place was going to require a hell of a lot of work by the new owner to make this thing salvageable. I remember thinking if it was me, I would just bulldoze this piece of crap and build a whole new house. Probably what they should have done anyways. So I go in there and start looking around. It was really just a bunch of old junk. Old furniture, pictures of people I didn't know from Adam. But there was this old school record player, but it definitely wasn't a cool old jukebox. 3 bedrooms, 2 bath, and 1 house full of crap. I was disappointed, to tell you the truth. So I go about starting to load up the first batch of junk, which was really just furniture. Couches and chairs, some kitchen tables. I filled the bed of my truck up till I couldn't fit up anymore, and drove a good distance to the dump. I drove back to get some more work done. I worked there all day long, cleaning stuff up. For some reason, there was a lot of broken glass. Not windows, just maybe glasses from the kitchen or picture frames. Who knew? It was like whoever left really did leave in a hurry. After a hard day's work, I sat down on the porch, lit up a cigarette, and enjoyed the sunset. This place just had the power turned back on, so the house was still kind of stale, like the air hadn't been utilized in a long time. So just sitting out on the porch was really a breath of fresh air. That night, though, it was really, really quiet. Like the air itself was paused or muted, and there was this, I don't know, a really weird smell. Like piss and dirty animal. I had this German Shepherd as a kid, but my dad made me keep it outside. So of course, it got really, really dirty. My dad didn't really pay that much attention to him, and he wasn't a very good owner. That's what that beast smelled like. Whatever the hell it was that I was smelling that night. Piss and dirty animal. Then I heard this, I don't know if it was a growl or rumble. I really couldn't place where it was coming from either, but it was enough to make me stand up and look around, that's for damn sure. The hair on the back of my neck stood up too. I grabbed my pistol and walked around the perimeter of the house. not out onto the property, just around the actual house. And it seemed on the left-hand side of the house was where that smell was the strongest. It smelled like something just took a piss right there and had been pissing there for as long as it wanted to. I actually fought back the urge to gag a little bit. I finished my cigarette and walked back to the front of the house to watch the sun finish setting. Before I came here, I didn't know if the power was on, so I had brought my lantern and a flashlight with me. And it was a good thing, too, because I couldn't find any light bulbs besides the ones that was up in the ceiling fan. But this guy didn't bring a ladder, so that wasn't happening. The bedroom I was sleeping in didn't have any light except for the lantern that I brought. I went to bed, but I decided to read for a little bit, so I just sat there reading by candlelight for maybe an hour or so, and then I decided to call it a night. I couldn't have been asleep for more than an hour, but I woke up to this howling. Hell, maybe it was a scream. I don't know. What I do know is that it was unearthly. It was ungodly. It was like something I've never heard before in my entire life. Sadly, though, it wouldn't be the last time. I don't even know how to describe what this thing sounded like. It was not human. Not entirely. It was like an animal and a man combined. A shriek and a scream and a yell and a howl and a growl all at the same time. Now you told me to look up the sound of the werewolf from An American Werewolf in London. It sounded like that, but longer and deeper. This thing sounded bigger. So I bolted out of bed. I grabbed my pistol and my lantern and I turned it back on. I listened again. A couple minutes went by in silence, but then that roar, or whatever you want to call it, sounded off again, and it sent shivers down my spine. I had goose pimples all over my arms and on the back of my neck. I listened, and then I heard it again. It sounded like it was close. Not close enough for me to see, but I guarantee you that it was on the back of this property. I looked out the window to try and see anything, but that road was so far out there, there were no lights around. All I could see was a few feet in front of me, and that thing wasn't showing itself. Not yet, anyway. The moon wasn't very bright that night either. I held my breath, and I waited to see if I could hear it again, but I didn't. I laid back down to try and get some sleep, but I was restless. I was unnerved by what I heard. I probably laid there for another hour. I don't know if this is real time or not. All these situations feel like it could have been an hour, but it could have been more or it could have been less. I don't know. On the room that I was staying in, which was the master bedroom, there's a deck on the back of it that's an extension of the wraparound patio, and the deck connects to a door. As I was laying there, I heard this big boom on the deck, and then something big ran across it. I mean, whatever the hell this thing was took 2 or 3 steps, and then it was gone again. I jumped up and I grabbed my gun. I ran out into the living room and flipped on the light that I knew worked, and I stood there in the middle of the room, just waiting to hear if I heard anything else. Waiting to hear that roar or something run across the front porch. But, again, all was quiet. I want to tell you something. I'm a grown man. I camp, I hunt, I know how to fight. Hell, I've been in more bar fights than I want to tell you about. And I don't scare easily. I'm a tough guy. But, for whatever reason, this just unnerved me to my core. So I spent the rest of that night sleeping on the couch with the light on. The next morning, I woke up after just a couple hours of sleep. I was stiff from the couch. My head hurt from lack of sleep, but I knew I had a job to do. The first thing I needed to do, though, was secure the perimeter. So I went out there, blinking from the sun. I had my pistol drawn and ready to fire, and I walked the perimeter of the house again. Walked the area where that rancid smell was, and for some reason, maybe it was just the lack of sleep, maybe it was worse because that smell was stronger. It smelled like something had pissed there again. I have to tell you, though, that in the daylight, where I could see all around, it was immensely less frightening. In fact, I kind of felt like an ass for even getting so worked up the night before. I started trying to rationalize what happened that night. I tried to convince myself I'd gotten worked up for nothing. That the house had been sitting there, vacant, for Lord knows how long. It was off the beaten path, so there wouldn't be noise complaints or neighbors calling the cops. So, it was probably a pretty popular place for vandals or transients to stay. Or even a popular venue for dumb teenagers looking to throw a kegger or something. Maybe that even explains why there was glass all over the place. Dumb teenagers doing dumb teenager things. I blamed those noises I heard on my overreaction, and even tried to rationalize them away too. Maybe, again, it was just dumb kids having fun and making noises, or even playing them over a speaker to scare some unknowing gal into the sack by being the big bad protective guy they could huddle close to. Hell, for all I knew, it could have even been a cougar in estrus. The only thing I knew for sure was I felt like a dumbass for the previous night, and I felt so much less anxiety that morning. I walked around the property for a little bit, taking in the vast amount of forest and land behind it. I had my morning smoke, a bag of jerky for breakfast, and set about my day. I actually managed to get a lot of crap loaded up and hauled off. I planned on clearing everything out and then starting the repairs. The only thing that hampered my schedule was how far away the dump was. 45 minutes one way. It would take me a good hour or so to load up my truck. Then I'd have to drive to the dump, unload, which was far less time consuming than loading up the truck. Just chuck everything out of the bed and then drive back. So one load took about 3 hours in itself. I managed 3 loads that day. Good thing this guy was paying for my gas too, right? After what I decided was the last load of the day, I headed back to the house. I considered going home for about 10 minutes. I could wake up very early the next day, drive to the house, start my day, but ultimately I decided against it. I needed to go back there. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't some chicken shit. I stopped at some general store and grabbed some light bulbs. Then I went to a Burger King for a Whopper. I had a fry and soda with that too. And then I stopped at the liquor store to get a little something to add to that soda. I pulled up to the house, got a little unnerved again but shook it off, climbed out of my cab and headed inside. The Whopper was delicious. I had me some extra tomatoes. After my meal, I went back outside to have a smoke. This night, the forest was absolutely alive. Bugs and night things chattered like no tomorrow. I kicked myself in the ass again for being such a pansy the night before. I didn't experience a thing that night, nor the next 3 nights in point of fact. That experience from the first night was all but gone from my mind. I finished loading up all vast quantities of crap from that house, started repairing it, and minded my own business. I even went into town one night for a drink at the local pub, although nobody seemed to notice me, and I kept to myself. Night 5, though? Well, Night 5 started a shitstorm of crap that I'm still trying to work through to this day. It was probably around 11, maybe midnight that night, and I heard the most god-awful cries that you could imagine. It was like something was getting ripped apart. Something was terrified, and it was dying. What I heard was definitely death cries. Now, being an avid outdoorsman, I've heard prey get picked off more than once, but the shit I heard that night was like nothing I'd ever heard before. And thanks to God, I've never heard those noises since. And then I heard that roar scream thing again. We're talking immediate goose pimples, hair standing on end, and shivers. It was like the first night all over again. It sounded far off like the first time, but let me tell you, when you hear something like that, it doesn't matter how far this thing is away from you. It's unnerving as all hell. I stood in that room for a good few minutes, trying to decide what to do. Obviously, this thing had the potential to kill something. Those sounds that poor animal made confirmed that for me. Then, the worst thing happened. That scream sounded off again, and it sounded a hell of a lot closer than the last time. Now, I was in a real situation. Do I turn off all the lights and stay quiet, or do I turn all them suckers on and stay in the light? How smart was this thing? It sounded big, but was it big and intelligent? What the hell was it that I was even hearing? I decided to turn the lights on. Hell with being in the dark. I waited to hear the sound again, but I didn't hear it. Instead, something big, strong, and pissed off slammed into the side of the wall outside. The same wall that had that god-awful smell to it. It sounded like someone was out there and slammed their fists on the wall, to tell you the truth. I almost dropped my damn gun. Then I could hear whatever it was walking around the patio outside. I felt like it was circling me. At this point, I was in the living room, and I could hear it walk around the patio outside of the kitchen, then the dining room, and then the living room. This thing sounded heavy. Really heavy. It continued to walk around the patio. Every once in a while, around the front of the house, it would stop, and so would my heart. As carefully as I could, I followed the sounds of it around the house. I didn't go into all the bedrooms, but I stood at the doorways, and could still hear this thing walking around. It circled about 4 or 5 times before it stopped for a little bit. I was dizzy from my heart pumping so fast. I had a million thoughts racing inside my head. What in the hell was going on? Could this just be someone dicking around with me? Maybe it was some druggie that used this house to squat in and was trying to scare me off. Maybe it was a couple of punks looking for trouble. The sound of this thing hitting the wall again pulled me out of those thoughts. At that moment, I made a decision. If it was some punk, I was going to let him know that I was armed. So I yelled out, "If there's someone out there, just know I have a firearm, and I will defend myself if I have to." I heard it run across the patio this time. It sounded bigger than a person. I heard something land on the ground off of the patio. It leapt off of it, I guess. Then that scream again. I still hear it sometimes. That's when I knew I wasn't dealing with a person. Or anything that I knew of. After a while, it started circling again, and this time I wanted to get a good look at it. I don't know if it was because I needed to know what I was up against, or if I had some wave of bravery and curiosity, or if I was just tired and annoyed of being so scared. But I wanted to look at this thing. As it went around the corner of the living room, I went into the first bedroom and killed the lights in there. I followed it around the house again, and when it turned that corner, I darted into the bedroom and tried to get a good look out of one of the shutters. All I saw was fur. This thing was massive, taller than I could even tell. I didn't even get a good look at its head at this point. But here's the kicker. The thing that sent me darting from that bedroom, hand over my mouth, eardrums feeling like they were going to explode from the pressure, was that this thing was walking on 2 legs. My mind was racing again. What the hell was that thing? What did it want? Was it going to find a way inside? Was it going to kill me? Was my death going to be fast? Was it going to hurt? I should have called my parents more often. Should have made more of an effort to meet up with my friends. I should have asked Tim and Melvin out on a date in high school. I choked back the urge to vomit. I lost track of where it was. I walked back out into the living room to try and hear it, but there was nothing. I stopped moving, closed my eyes and concentrated on the sounds, but I couldn't hear anything. I stood there for the longest moment, like an idiot, gun in my hands, safety off, ready to go out with a fight. I was staring at the windows, not really looking at anything specific, when I noticed something through part of the broken shutter. I was looking at a damn muzzle and a face, and this thing was looking at me. It found the one spot in the shutters that offered it a glimpse, and it was looking inside. The light was making its eyes glare this dull yellow color, and it looked just like a frigging werewolf. I didn't get too many details, and I'm sorry for that, but I did see where the eyes were, and they looked more intelligent than any animal that I'd ever come across. The fur looked dark, though. I couldn't make out if it was brown or black, but it did have a noticeable color difference between its face and the fur around its head. I yelled out in fright, and this thing bared its teeth at me. I aimed my gun at the wall and fired. I had no intentions of shooting at it, though. I didn't want to shatter the glass and give this thing a direct path to me. Although I doubt the glass or even the door would have stopped this thing if it really wanted to come in. As soon as I fired, this thing was gone. I've seen quick, but this thing could really move. It was like lightning. I heard it land somewhere in the yard again, and then heavy footsteps on the dirt. It sounded like it was running off. I held my breath and listened, still trying not to vomit or pass out. Hell, I was trying not to do both at once. After what seemed like a frigging eternity, this thing screamed again, but it was further away, and I sat down, exhausted, still shaking. I prayed it would stay away. Far, far away. I kept replaying those 10 seconds over and over in my mind. Seeing it seeing me, shooting at it. My mind wandered over to the thought of how long it was there. How long was it watching me before I even noticed it? This thing was standing absolutely still. Maybe even, I don't know, blending in? I don't know, and I don't want to know. How many times did that thing glance in there and get a good look at me while I was there and didn't even know that it was out there? I sat down on the ground of the living room and stayed there, gun in my hand. I stayed there until daylight. Again, the light of day gave me courage. I could see all around me, and I had never had an encounter with a werewolf during the day. But believe you me, I packed my shit and I got the hell out of there. But when I got outside, I was dumbfounded once again, because there were entrails all over the yard, probably from that poor animal that thing slaughtered the night before. I didn't waste a single second getting in my truck and getting the hell out of there. I drove 2 hours straight home, not stopping for anything, lost in thoughts about what I had just lived through. I called Paul and told him I wouldn't be finishing the job, and that there was some kind of werewolf-type creature out there. That there was some kind of monster stalking his property. He laughed at me. Of course he thought I was nuts. I don't blame him. We argued for a chunk of time. He called me a liar and unprofessional, and said that if I wanted out of the job, to be a man and just tell him. He told me he wasn't paying me. I called him some choice phrases. Said I'd get the money I'd earned, even if I had to call my lawyer. I didn't even know a lawyer, but it sounded good. A couple of weeks went by, and I tried everything I could to get the memories to fade away, and eventually I was at least able to sleep at night. Then one day out of the blue, good old Paul called me. He was quiet and sounded scared. "I need to apologize to you," he said. I saw it too. My mouth hit the floor. He said he saw the Dogman or werewolf or whatever it was in the middle of the damn day, just watching him. He got a way better look at it than I did. He put it at about 8 feet tall, black with brown markings, big paws. He described them as clawed hands, to be specific. He said it looked like a giant wolf standing on its back legs, long pointed ears and a long snout. He apologized again and said my check was already in the mail, but he really needed to see me to talk about what was out there. We met up, and he said he wasn't going to hire anyone else to go out there. He couldn't in good conscience. he didn't want anyone getting hurt, and said he never would have even sent me out there had he known that that creature was walking around the property. I told him no hard feelings. Those things weren't supposed to exist. I kept in touch with Paul for a long time, mostly through letters and Christmas cards, but once or twice a year we'd meet up for drinks. That thing out there was the only thing we'd talk about when we got together. Paul's passed since then, but I know he shared that story with his wife and his kids, so I'm sure his encounter will live on. As for me, I never married or had kids. I've told my close friends about this. Some believe me, some think I'm dicking with them. Now I just like to go to the bar and people watch. There's this whole truth about what's out there that all these lucky people are perfectly ignorant to. So I guess ignorance really is bliss. That must be nice. My name is Carrie. I'm 32 years old, and this happened to me when I was 17. I live in the lower peninsula of Michigan, in a pretty small town. Around here, there's this legend, or what I thought was a legend until I witnessed it myself. It's called the Michigan Dogman. It looks like a werewolf, but it's not one. It's something else. It has a wolf-like head and a human-like body, apparently with blue or amber eyes. It's larger than an average man, by a lot. Some people say it's more than 8 feet tall. It also walks on 2 legs and has a knack for scaring the living shit out of people. Allegedly, this thing shows up in 10-year cycles. I call bullshit on that part. It shows up when it wants to. The stories have been around a long time. I've always believed in them for some reason. I guess that made my encounter just a little bit easier for me to digest. I'm an open-minded person, maybe even a little gullible. I used to read the weekly world news when my Aunt Stacy would buy it and leave it on the coffee table for me to read. In 1997, we were supposed to be invaded by vampires from Europe, and that was supposed to trigger Armageddon. I guess I've always been a sucker for the supernatural. I have an aunt named Stacy, the one that read the weekly world news. I would spend a lot of time with her once my Uncle Bob passed away. She was an older gal. Really, she's my great aunt, but calling her that just seemed dumb to me, so she was always just Aunt Stacy. Anyways, she was the toughest lady that I'd ever met. She was about 70 years old or so by this time. She could drink any of the guys in my family under the table, had one hell of a dictionary of curse words at her disposal, and refused any kind of help once Uncle Bob passed. She'd go out and hunt by herself, and wasn't afraid of using the rifles that she and Uncle Bob had collected over the years. Really, the only person she seemed to enjoy having around was me. It was during the summer I was 17 that we decided that I'd stay with her all summer. She lived a few hours north of us, and it just seemed silly to keep going back and forth when I would just end up there all the time anyways. So, I packed a few bags and we had a girls' summer. It was during this summer that everything changed as far as how I look at the world. Like I said, I was always a sucker for anything paranormal, but this just confirmed everything that I'd ever thought was real. So this all started when she basically told me that I was going hunting with her. Now, even though I love Stacy to death, I never really had anything to do with her hunting adventures. I could never kill an animal, as I'm pretty squeamish and a really big sissy, so when she told me I was coming along, I just brought a book and figured I'd spend the day sitting in her deer blind, just reading while she scouted the land for something to shoot. I also really don't like the woods. There's bugs and snakes and other things that I'm not a big fan of. Nevertheless, I went deer hunting with dear old Stacy. I figured at the very least we could have a fun day together. If I knew then what I know now, I'd have locked the old lady up in the house and thrown away the key. But anyways, we packed a lunch, her ammunition, deer spray or whatever it was, and my book, and then we set off earlier than I would have even been awake. We went out to a deer blind that she and Uncle Bob had built themselves and settled in. This was really far out in the woods. I have no idea how far, but I know we walked a really long time. It took like an hour to get out there, it seemed. For a while, I just sat there and read while she was doing her thing. I kept thinking about how gross it was going to be when she bagged a deer and had to gut it. I was hoping so much that she didn't ask me to help her. I might have thrown up on her if she did. While I was reading, I saw her get up out of the corner of my eye. I looked up, expecting her to take her shot soon, but instead, I see this look of absolute fear on her face. Now, I've never seen her anything close to nervous, let alone have this look of fear on her face. I went to ask her what was wrong, but she looked at me and placed her finger over my mouth, shaking her head no. It was very clear to me that she wanted me to be quiet. I sat my book down and tried to see out of the blind, but from my vantage point, I couldn't see a damn thing. She covered the entrance to the blind with the little wooden cover and sat down, repeating the quiet motion that she just did to me. Not gonna lie, I was pretty spooked at this point, and my heart was starting to beat fast. Whatever was out there was bad news. We sat in the same spot for so long that my butt started to go numb, but I wasn't moving unless Aunt Stacy gave me the cue. I wasn't the kind of person to take charge. She was definitely leading this little excursion, and if she didn't want me to move yet, I wasn't going to. Finally, after what felt like hours, she took her hand off of my knee and started packing up. She put her finger to her mouth again, and I just helped her do it in silence. We got out of the blind as quietly as possible and started heading back towards her place. She kept looking over her shoulder and wouldn't let me fall behind her. I kept looking over my shoulder too. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I sure as hell wasn't going to be caught off guard. Finally, I had to ask her what was going on. She looked at me with this completely grim expression on her face, and all she said was, "It was the Michigan Dogman." I actually started to laugh. I thought she was just messing around with me and had just pranked the hell out of me, but she shushed me again and told me to pick up the pace. The look on her face made me think that she was serious, so I just kept walking. She started walking even faster, and I had no choice but to pick up my pace too if I wanted to keep up with this little old lady. It didn't take nearly as long to get back as it did to get there. And when we did get back, she brought her dog in the house, this big old lab named Smokey. She stood on the porch for about 10 minutes too, just staring out into the woods with her rifle. It was with her the whole time. Every time she was out there, for the rest of the time I was there, that rifle was there, slung over her shoulder. She looked like she was waiting for something to come out of the woods so she could open fire. She chain smoked while she was standing there too. Usually I'd see her have 1 or 2 cigarettes a day. In those 10 minutes, she smoked 3 of them. When she finally came inside, she poured herself a shot of whiskey too, and told me it was to calm her nerves. I was just sitting at the kitchen table, watching her do all of this, and thinking that I must have fallen into some kind of Wes Craven alternate universe or something. I asked her if she really saw the Dogman, or if it could have been something else. This is what she said, because it's something that I'll never forget. She told me, "I suppose it could have been a bear. If a bear walks around on 2 legs and looks like a werewolf. If it wasn't that kind of bear, then it was the damn Dogman. Now go around and make sure all the doors and windows are locked, because if it got our scent, it'll be here soon enough." That was it. I seriously thought of calling my parents and telling them that they needed to come pick me and Aunt Stacy up, because she'd gone completely off of the deep end. But there was just something about the way that she was looking and acting that I couldn't help but believe her. I mean, these legends had to come from somewhere, right? Did she really just see the Dogman? I think she did. We had dinner together that night, and it was very tense and quiet. She wasn't the usual talkative Aunt Stacy that I'd always been around. She'd spend a lot of time looking out the windows and double and even triple checking all the locks on the doors and windows. I just sat on the couch for a while in silence, watching her, thinking about what else it could have been, wondering what this would mean if she really saw the Dogman. I went to bed a little after midnight that night. I sat there with Aunt Stacy trying to have a normal conversation, but it was still very tense, and she still seemed really upset and detached. It was like her mind was 1,000 miles somewhere else. Or maybe her mind was still back in the forest, trying to comprehend what it was that we saw. Later on that night, it was about 2:15 in the morning, I woke up to Smokey going crazy. He had ran out of Aunt Stacy's room, and then was barking from the hallway all the way to the front door. He was going nuts, and Aunt Stacy couldn't even control him. She had her rifle with her, and told me that that thing was outside. Immediately, I was on the verge of tears. I wanted to cry, but I also knew that I needed to have a level head in case Aunt Stacy needed my help. Smokey was going absolutely batshit crazy, clawing at the door, chewing at the wall. I'd never seen him like this. Normally, he's just this big, goofy lab, but I guess in the presence of this predator that was threatening his family, he turned into a big, protective dog. Neither of us actually looked outside. I think both of us were just too afraid. What I do know is that at the front door where Smokey was going crazy, there was this gigantic slam, like somebody threw both their fists at the door at once. It actually rattled the picture of Aunt Stacy and Uncle Bob that was next to the door to the point where it fell to the ground and the glass shattered. Aunt Stacy just backed away from the door and pointed the rifle at it in case whatever was on the other side came on to the inside. She looked over at me and told me that everything was going to be fine, that she would never let anything hurt me. Even from where I was, and even though that thing was outside, I could still smell this undefinable, disgusting odor. If I had to put a definition on it, then it would be wet fur and maybe decaying flesh. There was a very strong smell of very potent pee. It sounded like something heavy was walking around on the porch, but after a few minutes the sounds disappeared. Smokey settled down a little bit too, but the hair was still raised on the back of his neck, and he was still really uneasy. He was walking around in circles by the door now, and he was whining, but sometimes he would growl too, that crazy demeanor had stopped. Stacy told me that she thought it left, and that we should try to get some sleep. Yeah, right. I was never sleeping again, especially in this house. There was a freaking Dogman outside, and this lady wanted me to just go get some sleep? I thought about calling my parents again and telling them that not only was Stacy crazy because she thought she saw a Dogman, but it turns out she actually did see a Dogman, and the reason she's crazy is because she wanted me to go back to bed. Needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep that night. In fact, I sat on my bed with all the lights on and just stared around the room. Even if it wasn't the Dogman, something was out there that was causing Smokey to go crazy, and it didn't smell human. Hell, I'd never smelled anything so gross in my entire life. What could be that potent that I could smell it from outside while I was inside? I guess it could have been a bear trying to get in. I'd feel a lot safer if it was just a bear. How weird is that to even say out loud? That you think that you want a bear to attack your house? I guess it beats the alternative, right? The next morning I was dead tired, and decided to actually get some shut-eye, and I ended up sleeping until past noon. When I got up, Stacy had lunch ready, and didn't mention the previous night at all. I saw the rifle propped up in the living room though, and figured that she'd just had it in case. Smokey was also acting normal. He hadn't shown any signs that he was nervous or upset with anything that was outside. And for a moment, just a moment, I had hoped that it was all just some big jacked up dream, but I know that it wasn't. The next few days were very uneventful, and in fact, I tried to push everything that happened out of my mind, as maybe this was just some horrible experience that we would never have to go through again. I didn't want to go back home, because I love being with Aunt Stacy so much, and if there was something out there that could hurt her, I wanted to be there to make sure that she was okay. Then one night, after 1 in the morning, Aunt Stacy woke me up. I bolted upright, and she clasped her hand over my mouth and whispered to me that it was back. She told me that it wasn't trying to get in, and it was actually just sniffing around the property. She'd heard something knock over the garbage cans and got up with her gun to take a look. I could hear Smokey growling behind her, though, but it wasn't like the last time, so I don't think it was close to the house. She brought me to her room, which was the only room on the second story, and told me that it was right there, but I couldn't see anything at first. As I looked out the window, squinting and trying to get my eyes to adjust to the darkness, I finally saw this big mass moving around. Both of us just stared out the window. She pointed out into the darkness that it was in the shadows at first, and then stepped into the light, and I could see the back of this thing. It really was gigantic. I couldn't get too much detail because it was pretty dark and it was kind of far away, but from what I could gather, it did look very wolf-like. It was covered in this dark hair, although I couldn't tell you if it was some shade of brown or black, but it was definitely walking on two legs, and it definitely looked like your stereotypical werewolf. It had those legs that look like they're bent backwards, but after some research and talking to you, I figured out that it's actually called digigrade, which means they just walk on their toes, and the part that sticks out is actually the heel of their foot. This thing was moving around slowly and cautiously, like it was investigating the territory that it was in. Either way, my blood ran cold. Absolutely cold. And my throat caught my breath. I couldn't breathe, and then Aunt Stacy put a hand on my shoulder and told me that she thought it was going to be okay. I looked over at her like she was crazy, and she just shrugged. She told me that that thing was just out there, doing what it does, and if it wanted to come in, it would have come in the other night, even with Smokey out there trying to protect us. Sure, it made sense to me, but like I told you at the beginning of this email, I'm a pretty big sissy, and I actually started crying because I was so afraid. It wasn't like I was sobbing or anything. It was more like when you experience something so intense that your eyes just start to water. Except my eyes didn't stop watering. This thing stayed out on the property for a few more minutes and lifted its head to sniff the air. And that's when I could really make out how wolf-like the muzzle looked. I'm sorry I couldn't get any other details from this thing, but that's all I saw. After those few minutes, it went back into the forest. Again, I stayed up the rest of the night with Aunt Stacy. I was too terrified to talk about it, but she was sitting in the living room with me, humming and petting Smokey. In the morning, we sat over a very nice breakfast that she had made especially for the occasion, and we talked about what we had seen. She asked me to describe what I saw. When I told her the few details that I could make out, she confirmed that's what she saw too. But then I asked her what she saw when we were in the blind. She told me that she would place this thing at about 7.5 feet tall, and the fur actually was a brown and black color. She said that the fur was very shaggy, and in some parts it was matted like a dog that was kept outside for a while and not taken care of. She told me that she saw claws on the hands, and that the hands on the front legs looked very human-like. Back then I didn't think of asking her if there was a tail, and she's not really in the position to tell me what she saw anymore. Her memory is going too much nowadays. She told me if she hadn't known about the legend of the Dogman, she would have thought that she was looking at a real-life werewolf. When she saw it moving around on two legs and it was sniffing around like it was looking for something, she thinks that it had actually caught the scent that day, and it followed us home that night. She wasn't sure that it wanted to actually cause any harm, because, like she said, if it had wanted to come in, it would have. With those claws and teeth, it would have made short work of all three of us, including Smokey. It still wasn't a very comforting thought. Just because it didn't break into the house didn't mean it wouldn't attack us in the woods or even in our own yard. There was a lot more of that conversation in the morning, but I really don't want to bore you with the details. The important part is we never saw it again. But I've heard a lot of other people talk about how they've seen it too, which is why I don't believe in that every 10 years bullshit. Aunt Stacy lived in that house for another 7 years, until she actually moved in with me when she finally admitted that she needed some help. I went and visited all the time, even after that encounter. I did learn to shoot her rifle within the next couple of days after seeing that thing though, and I think for the most part I've actually toughened up. Who knows when you're going to need to fight for your life against some unknown monster. We talked about that thing all the time. We still do when she's coherent enough to talk about it. And to this day, she believes it was the Michigan Dogman. And you know what? I agree with her. Legends are born from truth. And I think everything that people say about the Michigan Dogman, with the exception of that 10 years thing, is probably pretty accurate. That thing's out there. It walks on two legs. It lives in the forest. And it sure as hell resembles your stereotypical movie werewolf. Although, I don't think that that's what this thing is. I have no idea what it is, but I'm sure it's not a guy that turns into this monster on the full moon. Because all the times that I saw it, or experienced it, it wasn't during a full moon. And one of the times was during the day. So I still ask, what the hell is this thing? And what the hell does it want? Last fall, I had not one, but 3 encounters with black-eyed kids. Let me start by saying that before these encounters, I didn't believe in anything paranormal or supernatural. I would actually roll my eyes every time someone brought up the possibility of a Bigfoot or Loch Ness Monster sighting, and I definitely didn't give a second thought about their existence, which I did not think was true. I was, at the time, an atheist, and had been my entire adult life. I grew up in a Catholic household, and would be dragged to church every Sunday until I was a teenager, and I could make the decision of whether or not I wanted to go myself. Needless to say, I opted not to go. In my opinion, there was just too much evil and corruption in the world for any higher power to be watching over us. I want to keep my name and location out of my story. I'm going to refer to myself as John, and my wife as Mary to keep us safe. We do live in a major city in the United States, and we own and operate a small construction business. We have 2 children, who I'll call Tina and Liz, and a lab mix named Pluto. That's his actual real name. I'm telling you all of this because I want to show you that we are normal. We're an everyday couple that pay our taxes, raise a family, work for a living, and have absolutely no reason to make up a story for attention or any other reason. The first time I noticed one of these children, I was at the Wawa's down the road from our house. I was filling up my car and noticed this young girl staring at me from the corner of the building. She was young, younger than Liz, who's our youngest daughter. Liz was 12 at the time, so I estimated her to be about 10. She was short, but had long brown hair that just hung down around her. She was in a black sweatshirt and blue jeans and had tennis shoes on. She just kept staring at me while I was pumping gas. I watched her for a moment, curious, but she started to creep me out because she wouldn't look away from me. I pretended to check my phone, looked up at the pump to see how much I'd put in my tank, and looked back over at her, and she was still staring at me. Finally, the pump clicked and my car was full of gas. I got in my car, looked over at her, and she was still staring at me. I turned my car on and drove off. As I passed her, she followed me with her eyes, which I swore were as black as coal. As I drove back to the house, I told myself I was seeing things. People don't have solid black eyes. I thought about how creepy the little girl was, but then I started to feel bad that I hadn't stopped and asked her if she needed help. What if she was lost or something? My guilt got the best of me, and I turned around to ask her if she needed help, but when I got back to the Wawa's, she was already gone. I turned around and went home again. We had dinner, dessert, watched some TV, and I forgot all about the creepy little girl. A few nights later, though, as I was working in my garage, I heard someone say hello. I turned around from my workbench, and my jaw dropped. It was the same little girl from the other night. She was standing just outside of the garage and looking down at the ground. She was still wearing the same clothes as the other day, too. I asked her if she needed help, and she nodded. She told me her mom was supposed to pick her up, but she never showed, and asked me if she could use my phone to call her. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and walked over to her. I held the phone out, and she asked me if I had a phone inside that I could use. I started to get uneasy. This situation was just weird to me. It was like she wanted to go into my house or something. I had a perfectly good cell phone right there, yet she refused to use it and wanted the landline. You hear about this sometimes, you know? A burglar using their child to lure someone into letting them into the house and abducting them or tying them up and doing horrible things. I told her we didn't have a landline, that we just had our cell phones. That was a lie. I just really didn't want her in the house. Still looking down towards the ground, though, she sighed. She took the phone and walked a few steps away from me, dialed the number, and talked in a hushed tone. I couldn't make out what she was saying at all. She walked back over to me and handed me the phone, thanked me, and said her mom was on her way. Then she asked me if she could use my bathroom. I'm sorry, but there was no way in hell I was going to let this creepy child into my house under any circumstances. I didn't care if she had to use the bathroom or not. I lied and said the toilet was broken, but she didn't seem to believe me. Please, let me in. I have to use the bathroom before my mom gets here. Again, I told her it was broken, and she seemed to actually be getting irritated and mad. She asked if I had another bathroom. I did, but told her we only had the one. I need to use the bathroom, she said, almost demanding that it happened. She looked up at me at this point, and I noticed her eyes. They were jet black. I was right. What I saw the other day was actually real. I stumbled back towards the door of the house and fumbled for the garage door opener, not wanting to take my eyes off of this little girl. I managed to find it and shut the garage door, but not before this little girl screamed at me that she needed to come inside. Not that she needed to use the bathroom, that she needed to come inside. My stomach was in knots and hurting so bad. I was sweating and panicking. I felt like I needed to throw up. I didn't know what to do. I could still hear her outside. She said I didn't understand how bad she needed to use the bathroom. So we were back to that story. I yelled at her to go away, but she said she would only go away if I let her inside. I ignored her and ran into the house. I called the cops and told them that someone was harassing me and trying to get into my home. They told me to stay inside until they got there. My family was inside and wondering why I was so up in arms, and I told them that someone tried to come into the house, but I couldn't mention the eyes to them. Once the police got there, they gave the house a once-over and asked me to describe the person trying to break in. What was I supposed to tell them? That I was afraid of a little girl with black eyes? Come on, they'd think I was nuts. I gave them the description of her clothes and hair, but I left out her age and that her eyes were as black as a void. That night, I had the worst nightmares of that little girl. I dreamt that she was there, in my house, and standing over my side of the bed. She was staring at me with those cold, black eyes. Even in my dream, I was thinking about how much they reminded me of a shark's eyes. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare into this otherworldly being as she stared back at me. She reached out a hand to touch me, and I was absolutely terrified. I remember trying to scream and having no voice. And right before she touched me, I woke up. I looked around the room in a wild panic and threw the covers off myself. My wife was startled awake and kept asking me what was wrong. I calmed down and told her that I just had a bad dream. For the next week, I was more paranoid than I've ever been. I was always looking over my shoulder, both at home or at my job site, always waiting for that little girl to appear again. I just knew that she would. I guess that encounter hit me hard. I was having trouble sleeping, no appetite. I was always worried that she would show up when I wasn't home and attack my wife or one of the girls. I still couldn't bring myself to tell them what I had seen, though. All I told them was that if they see a little girl around the house, they need to avoid her and not invite her in under any circumstances. Of course, they had a bunch of questions and thought I was nuts, but I told them some story about how I thought that little girl was working with the people that tried to get into the house, and that they just needed to be really, really careful, and probably not even go outside without supervision. A couple weeks later, I was finally feeling like myself again. I pushed my encounter into the back of my mind and kept it there. Then one Saturday night, she came again. Except this time, she wasn't alone. The four of us were watching Dancing with the Stars when the doorbell rang. Tina got up to get it, expecting it to be the neighbor or one of our friends. Our living room is in the back of the house, so I couldn't see who it was. I heard her talking to someone, but it sounded like a normal conversation at the time, so I didn't think anything of it. She came back to us and told me she thought the same girl that scared me was at the door again. My heart sank. I'm talking all the way down my chest. My stomach instantly turned into a ball of knots. I looked over at my wife. She looked just as concerned as I felt. I slowly stood up and headed over to the door. This thing, whatever it was intent on getting into my home, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let her. I went to the door, and there she was. The same girl in the same clothes, standing at my door, except this time, a boy was with her too. He looked older than her, maybe early teens. He was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, and the hood was up. Neither of them were making eye contact at this point, but I just knew this boy had the same type of eyes as she did. I stared at them, my mouth dry from fear. I asked what they wanted, and the boy spoke first. "We need to use your phone. Can you please invite us in?" That politeness caught me off guard. If I hadn't already encountered this creepy little girl with jet black eyes, I might have offered to let them use the phone, but I just knew that these were no kids. They might have looked like them, but whatever these things were, they were not normal children. Still, there was this overwhelming urge to let them in, almost like they were trying to control my actions or something. I closed my eyes and told them they needed to leave. The girl spoke next. She said they couldn't go anywhere until they came in and used the phone. The boy looked up at me, and my breath caught. His eyes were as black as a void, too. I'm not sure why I was so surprised that his eyes were the same as the little girl's. I guess maybe just seeing someone with those soulless eyes like that just unnerves you. Knowing that there were two of them, though, scared me even more than knowing that there was one. For the next minute or so, we exchanged back and forth. I told them they needed to leave. They told me they needed to come in. I told them they had to get off my porch. They asked to use the phone. Each time they said it, though, they seemed to get more stern and angry. My wife started to come towards us, but I motioned for her to stop and told her to keep the girls in the living room. She didn't argue with me. I think she could understand the amount of worry in my voice. They said they needed to come in again, but now their tone wasn't as pleasant. The boy was very mad. It dawned on me then that they couldn't come in unless they were invited, which opened up a whole series of questions and thoughts that I pushed out of my mind for a later time. Then I started to pray, which I hadn't done in years. I spoke to God and asked for protection against the devil and his servants. That little girl didn't seem to like my prayer and told me to stop. That just made me pray even more. Then the boy said, rather sternly, "She told you to stop." Still, I prayed harder and repeated myself over and over, asking God to protect me and my family. "Stop that and let us in," the girl tried one final time. I shook my head at them, now confident that I had power over them. I told them in the name of God they needed to leave and made the sign of the cross in front of me. The boy hissed at me. He actually hissed at me. And then they both turned around on the porch and walked down the steps towards the street. I watched them walk away, but the little girl turned around for a moment to look at me. The boy said something to her that I couldn't hear. She nodded and turned around to walk with him again. Since that night, I haven't seen either of them around. I haven't had any other encounters, and I hope it stays that way. I'm proud to say I found my faith in God again through all of this. If there are things like black-eyed children in the world, then in my opinion there has to be some kind of God. I go to church every Sunday now, read the Bible, and urge my kids to do the same. I finally told my family about the black-eyed kids too, and you know what? They believed me. I actually think that's why I don't have a problem getting them to go to church with me. These encounters definitely changed my outlook on the world and the things that hide in the shadows. But I have to admit, it was all kind of for the better because I found my faith again. By the glory of God and through the power of prayer, we can stay safe from these things. God bless. John. I've been listening to your channel for a while now, and I've listened to everything you have. I like the way you tell other people's stories, so I'd like to send you my Sasquatch encounter. Unlike most of the stories you present where the person writing to you was afraid or even outright terrified, this encounter was something special to me. I was never scared of the Bigfoot that I saw. I never felt threatened. I love to be in the wilderness, then and still to this day. My mom was from Acapulco, Mexico. My dad is Choctaw. I grew up in the woods. I'm an avid backpacker and I try to camp out whenever I can. City life just doesn't impress me. I'd take the woods over being in the city any day. That's what you need to know about me, and that I was 24 when this happened. It was June of 1990, and I was camping and hiking in the Siskiyou National Forest that week. I started at the edge of the area, and every day I would hike a few miles further and make camp before the sun set. I'd hang out at camp for a few hours, go to sleep, wake up, and do it all again the next day. It was the best week I've ever had. If you like camping and hiking, I'd definitely do this at least once in your life. I've done it several times now, but this is the only time I've ever seen a Bigfoot. The national forest I was hiking in is about 130 miles from Willow Creek, the Bigfoot capital of the world. Willow Creek is also how you get to Bluff Creek, the location of the Patterson-Gimlin film. I believe that this film is real. I was already 4 days into my camping trip, and heading back towards my starting point when I heard what I now know was called wood knocking. I was in my tent already that night, and heard what sounded like someone, or something, hitting a branch across a tree. I didn't know what it was, and it wasn't too close, so I dozed off. A couple hours later, I woke up to the wood knocking again, only this time it was a lot closer, like about 200 yards away, maybe even closer than that. I sat up and listened until it stopped, probably about 5 or 10 minutes of it. It wasn't a continuous knocking, but I'd say every 20 seconds or so it would happen again. After a while, it stopped altogether, and I went back to sleep. The next day is the day that I will never forget. It was midday at the time of my encounter. I'd hiked a few miles already, and I was taking a break, also sparking up a doobie. I know, shame on me, but whatever. By the way, the bud had nothing to do with what I saw, just so you know. Anyways, I was sitting up against a tree and just happened to see this flash of reddish-brown fur when the light caught it. It was about 50 yards away from me and crouching down by these big bushes that were next to a tree. At first, my heart caught in my throat. I mean, I was thinking bear, of course. A Sasquatch was not even close to what I was thinking, believe me. I jumped to my feet, ready to get the hell out of there if need be, but I wanted to be sure first, so I stared into the bushes trying to get a better look. Then the sky shifted, and I saw a face that looked human, but it was not a human. Then we stared at each other, eyes locked. I think we were both trying to take in what the hell we were seeing. I mean, it's not every day this creature sees a human either, right? And sure as hell isn't every day that someone sees a Bigfoot. He knew that I knew he was there. The way he stood still and the way he stared back at me, I'm sure of it. Even though I knew I should be terrified, I just felt at peace. I was seeing something that not many people can claim. I was looking at the protector of the forest, right out of a Native American legend. I know it sounds weird, but I actually felt connected to him, and the forest. I felt like he was letting me see him. His fur was shaggy and, like I said, brownish red. His head was big, like a gorilla. Same type of face. Very primate-like. He had little ears, but I could see them sticking out of the fur because they weren't covered in hair themselves. I could see big, hairy shoulders. The hair on the shoulders was shaggy, and the same color, too. Then, before I knew it, this thing was gone. I almost didn't even realize it. I'm not sure if it moved backwards in the crouching stance that it was in or what, but the movement was fluid. He was there 1 second and the next he was gone, back into the trees. I decided it was probably time for me to get out of there too. I didn't know what I was going to do. I was literally in the middle of the woods and there was no way in hell I was going to get out of them by nightfall. So I just started walking. I still wasn't afraid at this point. I didn't have any real reason to be. This Sasquatch or Bigfoot or whatever you want to call it showed no aggression towards me, and I showed no aggression towards it, and I was respecting the forest. I carried a bottle with a little water in it to drown out the cherry in my joint, so I wasn't even at risk of starting a forest fire. Like I said, I love the forest, and I respect the hell out of it. The thing is, from what I've heard about these creatures, if you respect them and their territory, they respect you too. I learned that later in my life, but at the time of my encounter it was still something that I very much believed. As I continued to walk, I caught a glimpse of it again, off to my left, quietly and almost invisibly walking through the trees, following me. I saw it for how big it was this time. 8 feet, at least, maybe even 9 feet tall. This thing put basketball players to shame, and linebackers too, because it was more muscular than humanly possible. If this dude wanted to, he could race over to me and pull me apart piece by piece. I'm talking pull my limbs from their joints without any problem at all. Still though, it just followed me like it was curious. I kept hiking back towards my truck, just like I had been the last day and a half. I walked for hours, for miles, and he was following me the entire distance. The reason I knew he was still there, even though I couldn't see him, was the way the animals around us acted. They were all quiet. Occasionally, I would hear wood knocking too. Sometimes it was on my side, other times it was behind me. I wanted to approach it, to experience something that no one has ever experienced, but I'm not stupid. I wasn't gonna just approach a Sasquatch. I was gonna keep walking like I didn't have a care in the world, make my camp, and hope that he was as friendly as I was hoping he was. That's exactly what I did. I made my camp, pitched my tent, and waited until dawn. That night, though, I stayed in my tent as soon as it was up, just in case. Again that night, I heard the knocking, and knew it was my new furry friend. I don't know if he was communicating with another one, or if it was just warning everything else out there that he was in the area. But it went on just like the night before. This time it wasn't as close, and it never got closer. I think he was trying to keep his distance for the night too. Dawn came and I was fine. No run-ins with a Bigfoot, no close calls. Just this uneasy sleep. And honestly, I don't know if it was because I was nervous or excited. I started out earlier than normal that morning. I planned on making it back to civilization that day. And I hiked all day, only stopping to rest a few times when I really needed to. I heard the knocking a few times that day. Twice it was pretty close. 2 other times it was further away. I didn't see him again that day though. I think the closer I got back to town, the less he was around me, until he just stopped following me completely. The wood knocking stopped too. That was about an hour before I made it back. For a while, I just kept it to myself. I was afraid of what people would have to say about my claim, and that I'd be ridiculed. But I also didn't want people to go out there and screw with this innocent being. Eventually, I told my close friends and my family, and I was hit with mixed reactions. My mom and dad believed me. That was really all that mattered to me. My dad confirmed my belief about them being protectors of the forest, and he believes the reason my encounter was so peaceful was because the Sasquatch sensed that I meant no harm, and that the forest was my home too. This encounter really turned out to be a spiritual one for me. The forest is just so sacred to me that knowing these guys are out there brings me peace and joy. I still enjoy going backpacking. I still enjoy camping where there's nobody else around. I keep my ears open for wood knocking, and I keep my eyes on the tree line, hoping to catch another glimpse of one of these guys. I've hiked out there around Happy Camp, Wairika, Mount Shasta, even Willow Creek, but I haven't seen another Sasquatch since that day in the 90s. Maybe they know I want to encounter them again, and that makes me unworthy. Maybe they can smell the stink of the city on me and it turns their nose. I'm not sure. I did some research, and there have been over 30 encounters with Sasquatch-like creatures in the Siskiyou County alone. Knowing other people have witnessed something that was so profound that they would report it as a Sasquatch encounter lets me know that these creatures are still out there somewhere. And it also validates my own encounter. I know what I saw. Even though my encounter only lasted for seconds, it is ingrained in me that there is more in this world than meets the eye, and it's something I can never forget, especially after hearing so many other encounters around the same time as my own. It was in 2017, in Chicago. I was getting off of work late one night and heading back to my home. It was around 1 in the morning. I'm an armed guard, so my shifts vary depending on what I'm supposed to be doing. This night, I just happened to get off late and was eager to get home to see my wife and child, even though I knew they would both be asleep at this point. I was driving down the road, minding my own business, when I saw these two big, glowing red orbs coming fast behind me. At first, I thought it was a car speeding towards the back of my own car, and I started to swerve to the shoulder, not wanting to get in an accident on my way home. But this thing was coming up fast as hell. Whatever this thing was, flew up and over my car. It felt like it either hit the roof or ran across it, or maybe it was just the gust of wind caused by this thing that rocked my car back and forth. I slammed on my brakes and swerved to the side of the road. I quickly got out of the car and watched as this thing flew off into the distance. I could see the silhouette of this thing as it flew away. Whatever it was huge. It wasn't just some bird. The way it was flying made me think that it wasn't even any kind of animal, because it wasn't exactly flapping its wings either. It was more like it was gliding and making this swooping motion. Kind of like when you see a snake swimming in the water, but instead of side to side, it was moving up and down. The wingspan on this thing was enormous. It was at least as long as my own arm span, but probably even longer than that. And it had defined, almost human-like legs, and it was very, very human-shaped at certain areas of its body. The length of this creature as a whole was at least 6 feet tall, from head to foot. It was very dark out, so I could only see the silhouette of this thing, but those legs looked extremely powerful. I didn't see a tail or head or anything like that, and it actually looked like it didn't even have a conventional head shape. Almost like those descriptions of how a Sasquatch has no neck, just a head and shoulders. It looked like a hump on the top of the wings. The wings were attached to a torso. I didn't see any arms besides the wings, but they could have either been attached to the wings or the wings could have had digits. I don't know. The torso was connected to those long, powerful legs and what appeared to be almost human-like feet. Then, of course, those glowing red eyes that I'd seen earlier. As I watched this thing, something else struck me as disturbing. The entire time, it didn't make a sound as it flew. I got out of my car fairly quickly after this thing passed by me. So quickly, in fact, that I could still feel the residual wind that it caused as it blew by. But still, there was no sound. I stood there, watching the sky for only Lord knows how long, seeing if I could see it again, or if it was going to circle back. I was scared, but I did have my gun on me, so I wasn't that scared. I had the safety off just in case, hoping I could defend myself if I saw this thing again. After the shock of what I'd seen wore off, I got back in my car and just sat there for another moment, trying to figure out what kind of animal I could have just witnessed. In my heart, though, I knew I had just witnessed something paranormal. I calmed down for a few more minutes and then drove home. When I did get home, as I assumed earlier, my wife and daughter were already asleep, but I quietly woke up my wife and told her that I needed to talk to her. We went to the kitchen table and I told her everything that I had just witnessed. I could tell she was kind of irritated at me for waking her up, since I knew by now it was almost 3 in the morning. But she was trying to be tolerant because she knew that I needed to get something off my chest. She smiled at me and took my hand and said, "Baby, I really think that you just saw something like a crane." I shook my head at her and said whatever I saw was bigger than I was, that it wasn't a crane. I don't think it was any type of bird that people even know about. She told me that we should get some sleep and talk about it again in the morning, once we were rested and had a level head and a clear mind to think about what it was that I could have witnessed. She fell right to sleep, but I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind was still racing from what it was that I could have seen. I ended up getting up and looking on our computer to try and find something that I could have seen that would explain the events that took place. What I found was something called Mothman, and it fit the description of what I'd seen. Now, here's one thing that you need to know about me. I don't believe in junk like that. Or, at least I didn't until that night. When people would talk about ghosts or aliens or Bigfoot, I would laugh and shake my head, saying that none of that was real. But after seeing this thing, I knew that all those stories that people were telling now had the possibility of being true. I inspected the roof of my car the next day. There were a couple of scratch marks on it, but nothing impressive. Nothing that I could use as evidence for what I'd seen. Anybody else could have said it could have been a low-lying branch that scraped the top of my car at some point, but to me, I know that it was possibly that thing that flew over my car. Perhaps that creature was the culprit of the scratches. It wasn't until months later that I found out other people were seeing the same thing when I did all around Chicago. I got in touch with a couple of those people to discuss what we'd seen, but have since not really kept in touch. When I did talk to them, though, they described almost the exact same thing as I did. So I can assure you that even though Mothman is normally associated with Point Pleasant, something resembling Mothman, or Mothman himself, was in Chicago all those years ago. Hello to you, Supernaturalist, and all of the creatures of the night listening in. I just wanted to start by telling you that you have done a lot of good work. Getting people's stories out there and helping them come to terms with what they have seen must not be easy. But you do it, and you do it well. To quote Agent Mulder, the truth is out there. My name is Corey Fitzpatrick. I'm 29 years old and I live in Sacramento, California. I'm a computer tech by trade, but an avid outdoorsman by heart, and I love camping and hiking on my spare time. I'm married to my college girlfriend and we have 4 children together, ranging from 8 years old to a year and a half. I have seen the Dogman, experienced the terror that everyone talks about during an encounter, and I live to tell the tale about it. It was the most intense night of my life, and there were times I wasn't too sure that I'd make it home to see my family. But with God on my side, and maybe a little bit of luck too, here I am. It was the summer of 2016, and I was on one of my routine camping trips. I'd go off by myself and camp for a few days like I'd done since I was 16 years old. My wife was fine with it, since she would go on girls' weekends too. It was just our way of taking care of each other's sanity. This was my weekend to relax. I was going to hike and get back in touch with nature. I know it sounds cheesy, but that's what I do. Typically, I would park somewhere off the road, grab my supplies, and hike into somewhere off the beaten path. I loved spending time out there all alone. Usually, there would be no cell service. This was just something that happens up there, so I wouldn't be bothering having my phone on me. During this particular trip, I didn't even bother to charge it, which wasn't the first time that happened. This encounter happened in the El Dorado National Forest near Desolation Wilderness. It was the evening of August 12th, and it's something that I will never forget. As terrifying as it was also one of the most significant things that I had ever experienced, apart from marrying Diane and the birth of our children. It was absolutely life-changing. To cut to the chase, I was out wandering around, enjoying the forest and breathing the fresh, wild air. I was about 20 minutes from camp. I had a pack with water, some snacks, and emergency supplies, but I also had my sidearm with me on one hip and a buck knife on the other, just in case. The first thing I noticed was this weird, almost electric charge around me, like the air was static or something. It was weird, and I have never experienced anything like that before or since. It was actually enough to get me to stop and look around. The trees up that far are spread out enough to get a great visual of your surroundings. There was nothing around that shouldn't be. The birds were making noise, the bugs were chirping, just your normal nature noises. I heard this roar, but not like anything I've ever heard before. Yes, there is always the possibility of running into a bear up where I was, but this was not a bear that I heard. It didn't sound very close either, so I had the thought that whatever was making the noise could be distorted through the granite clearings where I was. But still, the roar, mixed in with that weird static I was feeling, made me think twice about continuing to just wander around. And so I just sat for a while, taking in everything around me, trying to listen for any other roars like I heard before, or anything else that might be out of whack. It was the first time I had wished that I had my phone. Even for just a simple text to my wife, heard a weird roar. Alas, my phone was in my tent, and I doubted it was even charged. I knew it wouldn't have service, so what was the point? I ate my sandwich, listened to the birds, and eventually got up to head back to my campsite. And that's when things started to turn into an episode of the X-Files. On my way back, I caught the whiff of something that, to me, smelled like old, rotting flesh. When I was younger, my uncle had some property out in Oakdale, and he had a cow that had died and started to rot. It smelled a lot like that. I'd stumbled upon some carcasses in my past hikes, so once again, being a naive guy, I just figured something had died and the wind was bringing the smell to me. I never, in a million years, thought that could be the smell of a Dogman. Alas, that's exactly what it turned out to be. I continued to head back to my camp, but the whole time I kept smelling this nasty, rotting smell. And then everything went quiet. I'm talking mute on a TV, no sound at all. That wasn't normal. That wasn't something I could just rationalize away. I started thinking of that movie Dead Silence, where the old lady possesses the dolls and makes everything go completely silent. Then if you scream, she kills you. You can imagine how high I jumped when I heard this growling noise coming from behind me. I nearly had a heart attack while jumping out of my skin. I turned around so fast I almost lost my balance. I unclipped my pistol and pulled it out. Then I saw what made the noise and almost dropped the damn gun. I was looking at this gigantic wolf. But it wasn't like anything I had ever seen except in my nightmares. It was probably 100 feet away from me, maybe less, but with the gray rocks around it, it made everything that much more visible. This thing was gigantic. It had to be 4 feet tall on all fours. Its front legs were bulging with muscles, but that didn't even compare to the back legs. They looked like a bodybuilder's legs. It had long, dark brown fur all over its body, like the length of a collie's hair. Fine and groomed in some places, but patchy and matted in others. Its paws were splayed open, like if you stretch your hand as wide as your fingers will go, and those fingers it had were long, not short and stubby like dog toes. These looked more like raccoon hands, or even people hands. Its head was wild. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a monster, like a werewolf, although I'm not going to use the term werewolf. This was something different. It was intelligent. It had this long, thick muzzle, like it had powerful jaw muscles or something, and these ears that perked straight up on top of its head. Its shoulders were higher than its head, and the elbows were pointed outwards like someone in mid-push-up. And it just stood there, motionless, staring at me while I stared back at it. I don't know if my brain was trying to catch up with my eyes or if I was just dumbfounded by what I was looking at, but I didn't move either. My gun was in my hand, just hanging by my waist, and I think I whispered something along the lines of, "Holy shit." Then this thing tilted its head at me, like it was trying to make sense of me too or something. Then the craziest part happened. It looked at my gun, like moved its entire head to look at my gun, and then looked back up at me. This thing snarled and bared all those lethal teeth, and it pushed up with its arms and rose to 2 feet. This thing was actually standing on 2 feet, like a goddamn person. I heard this popping sound while it did that. I don't know if it came from the Dogman or if a stick broke or something, but I definitely heard a popping noise. Now I saw how truly and utterly gigantic this thing was. It had to be 9 feet tall. Everything about it was just massive. I saw boy parts down below. He wasn't lacking in that area, if you know what I mean. And he stood there, panting in this wild rage, like a gorilla does when it's pissed off, and it snarled at me again before it started to back off. When I say back off, I mean it actually backed away, like walked backwards, still keeping an eye on me and still snarling at me, still on 2 feet. Then I guess, when it felt it was far enough away, it turned around and trotted off in the other direction, still on 2 feet. I watched this thing, still not moving, except for the whole body shakes I was experiencing. As it trotted off, it eventually got back down on all fours. My hike back to camp was filled with so many thoughts that I can't even really remember the whole hike. Although I do remember looking over my shoulder every couple of seconds to see if that thing was coming back. Luckily, like I said, the trees are spread out and sparse, so I had a pretty clear view of all around me. I remember thinking how stupid I was for coming out here all alone. Always thinking I would never get hurt or have a run-in with a wild animal. I guess it was that invincible mentality. I remember thinking that I wasn't going anywhere that night since it was already late and there was no way I could make it to my car before nightfall. I wasn't about to go hiking down a mountain in the dark, even without a Dogman in that area. That wasn't safe at all. And even as terrifying as the thought was, that thing I was almost frightened about more was the fact of never seeing my family again. At the time, we had 2 daughters, Kristen and Chloe, and they were both so little. I thought about my wife having to try to explain to them that they'd never see Daddy again. Or worse, that they would never find me and not even Diane would have closure of what happened. That thought made me want to vomit. But that thought gave me strength though too. I'd do whatever I had to survive. I started jogging back to camp, trying to save as much daylight as I could. When I got back, I built my fire as big as was safe and as close to my tent as I could. In my tent, I had my lantern, a flashlight, knives, my pistol, and my secret weapon, the shotgun I always kept in my tent for emergencies. I'd never had any run-ins with bears or mountain lions, but that didn't think I didn't know that it could happen. That didn't mean I didn't think about what would happen if one of them came into my campsite in the middle of the night. That shotgun made me feel safe. I wasn't sure I could kill the son of a bitch, to be honest though, but it sure would slow the mother down, and I didn't even have to be a good shot. I remember waiting for the sun to go down, dreading it for the first time in all the years that I'd been doing this. I felt confident that I'd make it through the night though. My tent was up against a granite wall. That thing wasn't coming up behind me, and I was at the door of my tent, in between it and the fire. I had my shotgun in my lap, my pistol on my side, the knife on the other. I was ready for that thing to make an appearance. I stayed in front of that fire, tending to it until I heard those crazy roars again. It was 3:41 in the morning. They were further off, but still, now that I knew what was making them, it was unnerving. I added a log to the fire, waiting 10 minutes, and then went into my tent, ready for that thing to come to me. Let it come to the tent. Let it stick its head in. I had a surprise for it. At that range, nothing was surviving the shotgun blast. The sun usually came up around 6 o'clock. I only had a couple hours left until daylight. Then I could safely get the hell off the mountain and back to my family with the most unbelievable story ever. I heard something big coming my way at 4:18, and everything else quieted down. Dead silence again. And then I smelled that horrible smell again, and I thought to myself, here we go. It was heavy, that's for damn sure. On the rocks, you could feel that thing moving around. It stayed far enough away to where I wasn't comfortable taking a shot at it, but I believe to this day that it was that thing that was outside of my tent. I could hear it sniffing around, like a canine would. I could hear it throwing rocks around. Big rocks, like it was frustrated that it couldn't get to me safely. I know that it recognized what a gun was earlier. I knew that that creature knew I still had my gun with me. And that was crazy to me. A creature, whatever it was, that recognized a gun and reacted in a way that a person would. This activity went on the rest of the night. It would stomp around my campsite and hit trees or throw rocks. It would sniff around, but it never came close to the tent. I could smell it the whole time. It was beyond nasty. It smelled hella bad, like rotted meat and animal pee and old wet fur. I smelled urine too, like this thing took a piss somewhere close. It reeked of ammonia and made for a pretty horrible night. Around 5:30 or so, the hints of light began to appear and this thing gave up, I guess. It actually grunted, like it was sick of me or something, and I heard it walk off. I still stayed in my tent though, until it was fully light, and when I finally got out, the campsite was littered with wood and rocks and sticks. I broke down my campsite as quickly as possible, all the while looking over my shoulder and around me to make sure that thing wasn't coming back. I quickly hiked back to my car, which was a solid 3 hours, and got the hell out of there. Once I got home, Diane could tell something was wrong, but I told her it could wait, and I gave my family the biggest, longest hug that they could stand. I told Diane all about it, and after she made herself a drink, and asked me to pretty much tell the story again. And she said she believed me. I've been out camping a lot since then, although I usually go with my brother-in-law now and always have my satellite phone with me. I've never seen the Dogman again, and I've never gone to that exact location, but there are times I'm tempted to go back up there, just to see. You probably think I'm crazy for that, but the way I see it, if you take the proper precautions, you can get out alive. Although this thing was big and definitely intimidating, it wasn't overwhelmingly aggressive. For all I know, it was just curious about me. It didn't attack me when it could have while we were face to face. Hell, I didn't even really know it was there until it made itself known. And it backed away from a potential fight when it saw my gun. And it stayed away from my tent and just investigated or tried to scare me. It worked. I was terrified, but still determined to get out of there alive. I'm probably 100% wrong about it, and it would have torn me to shreds if it had the proper chance, but I just feel these things are so shrouded in mystery that I can't help but want to learn more. Anyways, thanks for listening. I hope you guys can learn from my ordeal. Don't go camping out in the middle of nowhere by yourself. Take a buddy. That way you can stand back to back if the beast attacks. Have a great night. Corey Fitzpatrick.